Greetings, Sin and Space listeners. This week's trigger warnings include significant infant distress, an infant being separated kind of forcefully from its mother, a drug trip, which is very poorly written, and additionally, an insult of people who use drugs. So, proceed with caution. Sin and Space, Chapter 16. It's a little Mars baby. It's a little Mars baby. It's a little Mars baby. Little Mars baby, all our own. It was midnight, and Polly sang her song very softly so as not to awaken Jim. Her hand on the baby's back caressed the tiny, clearly defined muscles, rigid now with concentration of effort. Her eyes filled with wonder as she watched Sonny nuzzle awkwardly but successfully against her breast. He was eating. He was swallowing the milk and not choking on it or spitting it back. With a touch of awe at the thought that she was the only mother on Mars who had the privilege, she laid the baby over her shoulder and gently patted. Sonny bubbled and subsided. She laid him in the basket and sat watching him raptly. Jim rolled over and muttered, so she decided not to sing her song again. She was hungry anyway. She touched her lips to the baby's forehead, straightened his mathematically straight blanket, and went to the little pantry cupboard in the living room. A dish of leftover navy beans would settle her for 2 or 3 more hours of sleep. She found a spoon and began to eat happily. She cleaned the dish and licked the spoon, put them away, and started back for bed. She was halfway to the bedroom door when it happened. Everything went slower and slower and came to a stop. She was frozen on the floor, giggling, and she was also somewhere else watching herself giggle. The reddish walls turned the most beautiful apple green, her favorite color, and put forth vines and branches. They were apple tree branches, and they began to bear apples that were babies' heads, severed babies' heads, dripping rich, delicious juice. The baby sang her song in a creeping chorus, and she saw and heard herself giggle and sing with them, and pluck the heads from the branches, open her mouth. "Jim!" she shrieked, and it all collapsed. Her husband stood in the doorway, looked at her, and leapt to catch her. "Get Dr. Tony," she gasped, after she had vomited and he had carried her to a chair. "I think I'm going crazy. There were these... Get Dr. Tony, please, Jim." The thought of being left alone horrified her, but she clutched the chair arms, afraid to close her eyes while he was gone. She counted to more than 100, lost track, and was starting again when Jim and the doctor burst in. "Polly, what is it? What happened?" "I don't know, Doctor. I don't know. It's all over now, but I don't know if it's going to come back. I saw things. Tony, I think I'm crazy." "You threw up," he reminded her. "Did you eat anything?" "I was hungry after I nursed Sonny. I ate some beans, cold beans, and then it was horrible. It was like a nightmare, only I was watching myself." "This happened right after you ate the beans?" he demanded. "You didn't eat the beans earlier." "No, it was right after. I fed Sonny, and then I ate, and then it happened. I was frozen to the floor, and I watched myself. I was going to do something horrible. I was going to..." She couldn't say it. She remembered it too clearly. "That's too quick for food poisoning," the doctor said. "You froze, you say, and you watched yourself. And there were hallucinations?" "Yes, like the worst nightmare in the world, yet I was awake." "Stay with her, Jim. I've got to get something. Can you clean up in here?" Jim clenched his wife's hand in his big red fist and then began to mop. Tony came back with a black box they all knew. The electroencephalograph. "Look here, Tony," growled Candro. "If you're thinking that Polly's a drug addict, you're crazy." Tony ignored him and strapped the electrodes to the woman's head. 3 times he took traces, and they were identical. Positive brain waves. "You were full of Marcaine," he told her flatly. "Where'd you get it?" "Well, I never..." and "God damn it all, Doc," the couple began simultaneously. Tony relaxed. "I don't need a lie detector," he said. "It must have been put on those beans. Lord knows how or why." Polly asked incredulously, "You mean people go through that for pleasure?" "You had the reaction of a well-balanced person. It's the neurotic who enjoys the stuff." Polly shook her head dazedly. "But what are we going to do?" demanded Jim. "First thing is to get some bottles and nipples and goat's milk for you. Breastfeeding is out for at least the next week, Polly. There'd be Marcaine in your milk. You don't want to wean Sonny now." "Oh, no." Tony smiled. "We'll have to get a breast pump made, too, to keep your supply going, but that can wait till morning." "But," protested Jim. The doctor swung around to face him. "All right, what do you suggest we do?" Jim thought and said hopelessly, "I don't know." They had the milk boiling on the alky stove when Anna arrived with the first bottle. "The others are still cooling," she explained. "I'll go back for them later, but I thought you need one right away." She handed it over, went to look down at the calmly sleeping baby, and asked Polly, "What can I do?" "I don't know. Nothing, I guess. The doctor's showing me how to make formula, and I suppose that's all there is. It was awfully nice of you to get up to make the bottles. I feel terrible about making so much trouble, but I just—" She trailed off helplessly. "It wasn't your fault," Anna told her, then asked the doctor, "Do you want me to take over with the formula?" "There's no need to," Tony told her. "For that matter, you can go back to bed if you want to. There shouldn't be any more trouble tonight." "I have to go back and get the other bottles later anyhow," she protested. She took over the stove, showing Polly the simple procedures of sterilization and measuring involved in the baby's formula. Jim came back from a second trip to the lab in time to boil up one of the new nipples and fill a bottle before Sonny woke. Polly, still shaken but determined to behave normally, picked the baby up and changed him, warmed the bottle herself under Anna's watchful eye, and settled herself on a chair with baby and bottle. "You want to make sure the neck of the bottle is full of milk," Tony told her. "Aside from that, there's nothing difficult about it. Don't try to force his position. Let him wriggle around just as if he was at the breast." He watched while she nudged the new plastic nipple into his mouth. "That's right. Fine. I think he's going to take it all right." Sonny sucked hungrily, wriggled, pushed his mouth sidewise, and then to the other side, sucking all the time. Milk spilled out of the side of his mouth as he sucked without swallowing, and turned his reddening face from side to side, squirming desperately. Tony, suddenly frightened, took a step forward. He could see the trouble clearly enough, but from above, looking down at the baby's face, Polly couldn't possibly see what was happening. Sonny was trying to make use of the peculiar sideways suckling he'd developed at his mother's breast, but he couldn't wedge his small mouth around the comparatively firm plastic of the new nipple. Tony opened his mouth to speak. In a minute the baby would— "Stop it! Oh, stop it! You're choking!" Polly's hand, holding the bottle, shot away from the baby's mouth. Tony whirled to see Anna crumble to the floor, her mouth still open in the drawn-out shriek. "Jim!" he shouted. "Quick! Take care of her!" Then he turned back again, without waiting to see what Kandro did. He lifted the choking, convulsive infant out of Polly's limp arms, turned him upside down, and stroked the small, stiff back vigorously. Within seconds, a thick curd of milk dribbled out of the baby's mouth, and the terrible gasping sounds turned into a low, monotonous wailing. Tony put the baby back in his mother's arms and turned briefly to look at Anna. Jim had lifted her onto the wall bunk. Tony checked quickly to make sure she hadn't hurt herself. "Just fainted," he said, puzzled, and gave Kandro instructions to restore consciousness. Sonny's wailing was turning into a steady, vigorous hunger cry. The doctor picked him up again and wrapped him in one of the warm new blankets. "Where are you taking Sonny?" asked Polly with shrill nervousness. "To the hospital." He turned to Jim, still standing over the unconscious Anna. "Don't let her leave when she comes to, Jim. I'll be back later." He went out, carrying the screaming baby in one arm and his black bag in the other. The walk back to his own house was haunted. The ghost of a newborn baby went with him along the curving street in the dark, a ghost that gasped and choked as Sonny did, twisting in agony until it died again, as it had already died 1,000 times for Tony. Only the first time was the worst. The first baby born, and the first one dead in Sun Lake, and he'd had to watch it all, the ghost of a baby that had died for want of air. He went in by the hospital door. He didn't want to see Graham. Systematically, he turned on the lights and assembled his instruments in the sterilizer, turned a heat lamp on the examination table, and stripped off the baby's clothes. This couldn't go on. There had to be an answer to Sonny's troubles, and he was going to find it now, tonight. Tony examined the child with every instrument and technique in his repertory. He felt it, probed and thumped it, listened to its internal plumbing. He could find nothing that resembled organic trouble, and he could think of no rational explanation for a masked baby breathing through its mouth. "It's got to be nasal," he said out loud. 3 times he'd used the otoscope, and 3 times he had found no obstruction, but... Carefully, Tony slipped the mask off Sonny's nose. He slipped it over the mouth instead, stifling its scream in mid-voice. At least, he thought grimly, the baby would have to breathe through the mask now if it wanted to keep on crying. The doctor began to probe delicately into one nostril, and Sonny promptly reacted with the unexpected. Impossible or not, he tried to draw breath through his exposed nostrils, found an impediment, and began to choke again. Tony withdrew the slender probe and stared at the gasping, red-faced infant. For just a moment, a clear and frightening picture of the other baby blotted out what was before his eyes, the ghost baby that had come up in the street with them. Then he looked at Sonny again, and everything began to fall into place. Sonny was the wrong color. He should have been blue, and he wasn't. He was gasping for air. He couldn't breathe. He should have been oxygen-starved, and he was flushed a bright crimson. It wasn't lack of oxygen, then. It was impossible, but it was the only logical answer. Tony removed the mask from the baby's face with trembling hands. He waited. It took Sun Lake City Colony Candro less than 30 seconds to do what Tony knew he couldn't do, and most certainly would do. Sonny gasped sharply for a moment. Then this breathing became even, his color turned a normal, healthy pink, and he resumed his monotonous hunger cry. Sonny didn't need an oxygen mask at all to survive on Mars, nor did he need oxen. The fact was scientifically paralyzing. The child was adapted not to the rich air of Earth, but the deadly thin atmosphere of Mars.